In this lecture, we're going to do something that, from the viewpoint of many people, is just simply outrageous. We're going to move from two figures who at least have some things in common, and that's Foucault and Habermas, both of whom deal with the problems of what I've called modernity, and I hope that word hasn't thrown you too bad. It's not such an abstract word. It means the processes by which factories were instituted based on the division of labor, and the processes by which institutions came to be rationalized, ruled, governed across the whole terrain of our social life with few exceptions. That's the process that I've been referring to as modernity, and far from being abstract, it's a part of our everyday life. It's called work, it's called hooking up the telephone, it's called applying for a job, it's called dealing with the IRS. This is modernity. So don't get lost in the fanciness of the word. That's modernity. I've argued that it has these pathologies. Foucault has argued it's had them. We've also argued that it has an upside. And in any case, with that, with a little bit of tie-up of the other lectures, let me begin with this outrageous attempt to try to deal with perhaps one of the trickiest and strangest philosophers, if he is a philosopher, around today, and that's Jacques Derrida. I think his name has become synonymous with a kind of evil among many analytic American logic-chopping philosophers. I mean, Derrida is responsible in many ways for deconstruction, that dreaded enemy that has invaded our literary departments, that according to popular mythology tells us that any way to read a book is as good as any other, that there's nothing outside books, that we're always reading, and every reading is a misreading, and so on. Now, in my view, Derrida believes none of these things that I've just outlined. I'm trying to give you the popular demonizing mythology about Derrida. I've brought in just one of his books today to show you, but he's written many. This is Margins of Philosophy. Its title is very significant for Derrida's project, which is to examine philosophy as a broad, long-standing cultural institution stretching back to the Greeks, and to try to do so in a framework that reminds us that philosophy, so understood, is the product of Indo-European languages, to the extent that we know what that phrase means, and the product of Western civilization. It is not an eternal project in the mind of God, but a project with a certain materiality, a certain history, and that many of the most interesting things that we will find out about philosophy won't be from reading it badly or from saying any reading of a book by a philosopher is as good as any other, but will be by paying attention to the very things the philosopher tried to repress in his text, the things that the philosopher tried to put on the margin, as it were, of the text of philosophy, the things that the philosopher wished to exclude. By drawing our attention to these, Derrida in some ways is like Freud. See, Freud wanted to investigate things like slips of the tongue, jokes in the relation to the unconscious, and so on. In a way, Derrida's meta-philosophical project is to investigate philosophy's slips of the tongue, philosophy's unconscious witticisms, and so on. So, this is not an unworthy project, and it is rooted in a profound concern with that earlier figure that we discussed at not nearly enough length, and I won't have nearly enough time to do justice to Derrida now. I just want, if I can dispel a few myths about him, I will have done some good in the world, because even a brief meeting with me convinced me that he was just a fairly jolly French person, and certainly not out to tear up the American university system. Derrida is an academician, he is a very careful reader, and he has some unorthodox views about language and about the history of philosophy. And since I have at least one very good friend who knows his work well, I will draw on some of Louis Mackey's remarks today, and I will also draw on the Americanized version of Derrida that has been presented to us by Richard Rorty. Now, I'm not saying Rorty fully subscribes to everything Derrida says, but Rorty is one of his American admirers. To the extent that he is, that is, as it were, put Rorty in the enemy camp as well, which he is to many analytic and positivist-minded philosophers. Rorty is one of the enemy. It's kind of hard, since Rorty's closest philosophical analog would be Dewey. In a way, he is a very American. And in certain ways, Derrida is more American than the Brits that we use as our models for much of the analytic philosophy we do. I'll try to explain that as I go along. Okay, let me give you something that I was asked for by a reporter from the Chicago Tribune who was covering the debate over deconstruction, and he went, "What the hell is this stuff anyway?" So this 45-minute lecture to an hour will be an attempt to answer that reporter's blunt question, "What the hell is this stuff anyway that's causing so much trouble?" I'm going to try to answer that. Well, deconstruction as a term originates in Heidegger's project that I've already discussed, where I said that Heidegger wanted to perform a deconstruction of metaphysics. A deconstruction of it. Not a destruction, but a deconstruction. In other words, to sort of dig through it, underneath it, to read it in such a way that he could uncover, in some sense, the hidden history of being. Now, as his project progressed, and that's being with a capital B I just used, as Heidegger's project progressed, it became more and more obvious to him that it was futile. That being is, being with the big B is, blank, was a blank that was going to be difficult to fill in. So in the very late Heidegger, when he wrote the word being, he drew a line through it, like that would help. He'd write the word where you could read it, but he'd draw a line through it, which he called writing being under erasure. Now the point of that was this. This is its connection to modernity and the things we've been discussing, including the self. In the medieval period, beings, entities like us, found our meaning in being, and ultimately in the being, the highest being. In fact, philosophers, I sometimes think, when they use the word being with a big B, mean something like God, but just aren't straightforward enough to say it. It certainly seems, I mean, in a certain way that seems to be the case. Well, Derrida is a step beyond Heidegger. Derrida has noticed, as one could hardly fail to notice, that the history of Western metaphysics has been filled with the attempts to answer the question, being is blank, and to fill in the blank. And if you follow the history of Western metaphysics, being is the demiurgos, being is God, being is whatever is uncovered by the empirical sciences, being is this, being is non-existent. Whatever we've tried to fill in the blank with, we have not yet reached closure. That's why I said that philosophy is a funny endeavor. It has a 2,500 year history of failure, and yet it continues. So obviously it's not quite in the spirit of capitalism to engage in this enterprise. It's a long time to run a failing business, 2,500 years. Derrida has noticed that this blank can't be filled in. Being is, can't be filled in. The blank can't be filled in. Why not? I mean, we want an argument. We don't want this. I mean, the first thing is that we've noticed that no one's ever successfully filled it in. That's the first thing we notice. That, you know, the history of philosophy has not yet presented us with final wisdom, total coverage, and ultimate truth. We know that, so that's step one, is to know that. Deconstructive readings try to work this out in detail, case by case. different attempts to answer it and how they fail to answer it. And so deconstructive readings are not a single technique or even a special set of techniques. They're more like housework. See, philosophy is not like building a house where you start with a firm foundation and build it up and you're finished and you walk off, and that's philosophy. Philosophy under the heading of deconstruction is housework, which means every day the floor is to be swept again. The dishes have to be done again, and I'll be damned, the next day it's just like that again, and it's just like that again, and it's just like that again. So deconstruction, if I wanted to compare it as a practice to some other practice, it would be housework. It doesn't get finished. In fact, that is at the heart of, I think, the best of philosophy in the late 20th century, is the idea that it's not getting finished, and it can't be. Why have philosophers failed to answer the question being is blank, or to fill in the blank? What is being with a capital B? Well, Derrida's take on metaphysics, as I say, is this insight that they failed to answer the question, but he also has a certain take on language. It's not exactly a theory of language, because Derrida thinks one of those is still to be completed, and it's still part, the language we speak now is still part of our metaphysical heritage. I mean, we use metaphysical phrases all the time, even when we don't think we do. We say, that horse appears to me to be lame, and then we've invoked, the concept of appearance with its long philosophical history. Or you can be a baseball scout and say, that kid has the potential to hit 300, and now we've invoked the metaphysical language of potentiality with its 2,500 year history. So for Derrida, our language is chipped through with metaphysical moments, fragments in our language. There's no way around it. And in that sense, Derrida certainly wouldn't say that he has avoided metaphysics. The reason he wouldn't say that is that he speaks a language. What he wants to do is to get a better take on why the language can't solve the problem that is central to metaphysics and ontology, the problem of answering the question of what is being, Now, here's the take. It is the nature of language, and Derrida takes it to be something quite other, language to be quite other than what many, many other philosophers and linguists take it to be. And this is going to be very difficult to do in a short time, but I'm going to try. For Derrida, language is not, and I'll have to do this through a series of negations first. Language is not constituted by reference, which is a standard positivist account. In other words, what constitutes reference would be, I use the word horse to refer to the horse. Of course, that makes it sound as though what would constitute my talk, that it refers, namely, to the world, would be that I am speaking about some present horse. My word stands for that horse. Now, you may have noticed there's no horse up here with me. Derrida has noticed that. Words do not stand for things. They stand in for them. Let me make that distinction again. Words do not stand for things. They stand in for them. The word, the noun horse is convenient, like the noun fly, the noun potato, or the word potato chip, the phrase cow chip, the name Neil Bush. Because I have all these words, I don't have to carry a kit bag of all the entities in the universe to point to when I talk. I mean, in other words, the theory of reference makes us think as though what's referred to has to have a kind of presence. Derrida, as usual, engages in, and this is a usual deconstructive practice, a kind of reversal. Interestingly enough, that word gets its meaning not from the presence of the horse, but from his absence. Now, it also doesn't get its meaning in isolation. Words are not atomic bits of anything. Words are part of systems of speech. Let me try to make that clear, the way Derrida looks at it. Systems of language. Let me take chess as an example, a famous example, one used by Wittgenstein. If I take a pawn off the chessboard and just put it here, you'll still know that it's a pawn, but it won't be able to make any pawn moves. To make the right moves, it'll have to be on a chessboard and deployed in a game. In other words, there'll be conditions within which it'll make sense to move the pawn 2 squares forward. One of them won't be to set the pawn on this thing and say, I'm going 2 squares forward, because looking ahead of me, I don't know what would count. Is that a square? In other words, it's just not the way the game is played. With systems of languages, they're constituted by the way the words work in these sets of constitutive rules, which frequently overlap and are holistic. For that system to work, the objects so referred to do not have to be present. In fact, I've just tried to give you an example in which I pointed out that it is the absences of objects that make the use of nouns in languages interesting. I mean, that's fascinating that we can come in here and discuss an entire basketball series without having Charles Barkley or anyone present. This is an indication that absence is one of the constitutive features of language. Okay, another an important thing to remember is this. I don't want to commit the bad abstraction to which philosophy has fallen victim so often by treating language as something other than the following sets of things. It is a system, but it has materiality. Language is phonetic sounds that can be heard in finite lengths, measured and so on. And it is marks, sensible marks on paper. And here we will attack another view of language. I mean, again, a lot of Derrida's remarks are negative concerning other views of language. Just like reference couldn't be what gives our words their meanings and our uses of them and so on, neither can intentionality of speaker. Now let me try to use one of Derrida's famous examples. I draw up a grocery list for my wife. I write it down in sensible marks. These are the things we need: toilet paper, we need stuff for the kids, you know, all this candy, and then of course cash so that we can buy fast food for supper. It's a standard way of shopping. I leave the grocery list and I drive away and I'm killed utterly. I'm run over by a bus, flattened like a tortilla. My wife comes in, and can my message function in my radical absence? Yes. She can still go to the store, buy the kids food, and maybe only later will they notice, where's Dad? And then they hear on the news, you know, overweight philosopher flattened by truck, tortilla. Those signs can work in my radical absence. Now, can they work if I had no intentionality at all in writing them? Yes. Suppose I wrote them 3 months ago with the intention, or not, well, let me make it even a simpler example. Suppose I wrote them that afternoon with the intention of having my wife leave the house so I could call a lover. Would that make the list ineffective because my intention was misunderstood? No. Many philosophers have wanted to tie meaning to what the speaker and or language user intends. But words have their functions. They're, to use Derrida's phrase, they're disseminating meanings apart from those intentions. Now, let's don't caricature his claim. This does not mean that we cannot intend. We can. But it means we cannot fix meaning by our intentions. This is very important when we read a text by an author in philosophy, because we're frequently led to ask the question, what did he intend to say? And a deconstructive reading will lead us in the direction of Not what did he intend to say, but what are these physical marks? How can I interpret these physical marks? To use that example, and that, by the way, is an anti-hermeneutic remark. It's a remark sort of against what might be called the idea that there could be the right interpretation. This is another important part of Derrida's take on language and language practices. The idea that there could be the right interpretation. In a way, there's no more powerful idea in the discipline of philosophy than the idea that there can be the right interpretation. After all, it's that idea that allows us to give our students B's and C's as opposed to the A's we would make if we had written the paper. It's what keeps us, it seems, continually reading Aristotle and so on in order to get them right. Finally, Derrida makes the outrageous claim that in the last analysis, there is no such thing as the right reading, the right interpretation. There is no interpretation that can bring interpretation to an end. Good books, really great texts, do not cut off interpretation. They lead to multiple interpretations. Great examples of this would be the Bible, which I think is pretty obvious, has not yet reached closure on interpretation. I mean, you know, I grew up in a community where there were Baptists, Methodists, Church of Christ. Took me a while to get into the city and meet Jewish people, Muslims, others. It became clear to me that reading the Old Testament was difficult to come up with the right interpretation. And what was wrong was the very idea that there could be the right interpretation. Now, the converse is the claim that people find outrageous, but it's not made by Derrida. That means since there's no the right way, then any way is as good as any other. Now, Derrida is not compelled to hold that view, and he doesn't. Not every way to speak and or read is as good as every other. And let me just put it simply. No one holds that view. Derrida, to the extent that he refuses to play a standard philosophical game, just will not play. The fact that there is no final book, you know, one last master encyclopedia containing all the wisdom of total coverage, final knowledge, the last book, none other ever needs to be written, Derrida considers that a reductio ad absurdum of the idea of perfect interpretation, the right interpretation. This does not at all mean that we don't, in loose, rough and ready ways, judge interpretations all the time. And this does not at all mean that, practically speaking, some interpretations are obviously slightly better than others. Let me return to familiar ones like the traffic light. If it's red and you see it as green, the outcome can be disastrous. Derrida doesn't deny it. You know? It's a bad misreading. Bad misreading. But this is a familiar mistake, and it's made about a lot of Derrida's work. Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this. That is a straw person argument. No one in the world believes it or ever has believed it. No one, Derrida or anyone else, believes that every view is as good as every other view. That's only a view we discuss in freshman philosophy class in order to quickly refute it. I mean, no one believes it. There are no defenders of the view. And since this tape will be going out, if we run into one, it will be interesting. But we will likely find that person in one of the institutions that Foucault discussed rather than in some seminar. Okay, I mean, that's where we'll find them, if anybody believes that. Now, Derrida's kind of slippage is to remind us that the text of philosophy is not fixed, cannot be fixed. It is of the nature of the text of philosophy and its relation to language that we cannot fix it once and for all. In a way, it's like the leaky ship where we haven't got anything to stop the leak, so we just keep bailing. I mean, the leak is in the language. One way to give you an analogy that may make it come alive and be simpler for you, and that's been hard for me to do with a philosopher who's very difficult like Derrida, is to think about it in the context of the way that Augustine attempted to develop a rhetoric about God. And then Augustine realized that it was already impious to use finite human marks and sounds to praise an infinite being entirely separate from those finite marks and sounds. So he was driven to silence. If one were to take that same picture of language without the thought of developing a rhetoric of God, but left just with the finite marks and sounds, and no inner teacher, Christ, the inner teacher, to tell us when our signs worked and when our words referred, then we would have a language that operates by disseminating meaning, by moving meaning, by shifting it. So if you were to have, for example, Derrida criticize Habermas, Habermas would say something like this. He would go, understanding is a condition for our linguistic practices. Derrida would respond, if that is so, then so is misunderstanding equally constitutive. Because understanding won't make sense conceptually unless misunderstanding does. They are correlatives. Does that make, well, I hope that makes sense. I mean, I'm asking a rhetorical question now about a philosopher who does rhetoric, but anyway, as well as argument. So these are the kind of things that irritate people. In addition, and this is, I think, the take on language that he has, basically words can always misrefer. They can always misrefer. Our meanings can always go astray. Even when we point, this is the most simple example analytic philosophers use. I can say, get me that cup there. And you could still pick up this one instead of this one. Pointing won't even guarantee a reference. And if it's possible to misrefer, if it's possible to misread, if it's possible to misunderstand, then it belongs to that structure I've called language to do those things, because a possibility once is a necessity forever. Let me say that again. A possibility once, when we speak in structural terms, is a necessity forever. This is what makes original sin so interesting. Human beings who don't sin are still sinners in the Christian tradition because the possibility once is the necessity forever. The possibility once is the necessity forever. Now, these are subtle views. Derrida is frequently caricatured for these views. We would all like to hold theories of meaning that made fundamental experiences like pointing, what meaning was about, and so on. But I don't think Derrida's views lead to... what I'd like to give you now is what I would call the upshot of some of the views, and I don't think they're that outrageous. The upshot, as I've said, is that there will be no final interpretations in philosophy. And I think the history of metaphysics bears that out, and the history of philosophy. There will be no last books. Even the Bible wasn't a last book. I wonder how many commentaries have been written on it. There will be no last books, no final commentaries, no ends to the flows of information. Meaning is not fixable or fixed, even humanly in a certain way. Since we speak the language of metaphysics in a certain sense, I've already talked about potentiality, appearance, and so on, in a strange way, language has a power to operate in the radical absence of man. I used the example of my own death in the laundry and the list for my wife, but there are many other examples. You find as it were, a monument in stone, and you can decipher the cuneiform. And that form of man, again, the ideological term, has disappeared for ages of time. But the words, as materiality, still can be interpreted, not finally, but they still have their effects. Their effects. Now, to some of the political upshot of Derrida and why I think he does outrage people. Looking at philosophical language as metaphorical, largely metaphorical. In fact, if you've understood what I've just said about Derrida, you'll see that the sense in which it's frequently said that for Derrida all words are metaphorical. By that he means that no word is the thing. The word horse is not a horse. The word cat is not a cat. The word neutrino is not itself a neutrino. There are some exceptions, but not really. Is the word a word? No, because I have mentioned it and not used it. It's now become a token of a word. So what I'm trying to say here is that words are not things. That the attempt that philosophers have made to hook words to the world has failed, but it's no cause for anyone to think that we're not talking about anything. See, this doesn't make the world disappear. It just makes language into the muddy, material, somewhat confused practice that it actually is. Or that, at least, according to Derrida, it actually is. Now, here's some of the upshot of it that I think has caused people to be upset. Not only this business about better and worse readings, which people go, well, what's a better reading of something? Damn it, nothing means anything anymore. These are some of the things that upset them. Everything can't be a metaphor. I mean, sometimes I mean what I say, damn it, and I just mean it. I mean, these kind of frustrated remarks by professors who've been around a long time. The most irritating thing of all, and I think I'll read a short passage if I have time. Am I running? I think my time's running okay. I'll take a very short passage and because it's particularly irritating. In his article, White Mythology, Derrida makes a point about the metaphorical nature of philosophical language. And I think he makes it in a rather humorous way. He uses a story from Anatole France, in which Anatole France is giving an analysis of a philosophical passage, and he takes the following passage. Anatole France does. Derrida's just discussing it. Wherefore I was on the right road when I investigated this sentence. And here's the sentence investigated by Anatole France. The spirit possesses God in proportion as it participates in the absolute. I think that's actually a sentence from Hegel. Now, Anatole France goes on to say, it was important to see that these words were signs that had, as it were, changed meanings and shifted through time. It was important that we were able to do a translation. The spirit possesses God in proportion as it participates in the absolute. What is this, if not a collection of little symbols, much worn and defaced, I admit. Symbols which have lost their original brilliance, how they must have sounded maybe in Greece or maybe even in 19th century Germany. Their original brilliance and picturesqueness, but which still, by the nature of things, remain symbols. And I have been able, without sacrificing fidelity, to substitute one for the other, to as it were, update this into a more modern. And in this way, I've arrived at the following translation. The breath is seated on the shining one in the bushel of the part it takes in what is altogether loosed or subtle. And then we get the next step of translation. He whose breath is a sign of life, man that is, we will find a place, no doubt after the breath has been exhaled, in the divine fire, source and home of life, and this place will be meted out to him according to the virtue that has been given him by demons, I imagine, of sending abroad his warm breath, this little invisible soul, across the free expanse, the blue sky, most likely. And now observe, says Anatole France, and now observe, the phrase has acquired quite the ring of some fragment of a Vedic hymn, just by returning it to sort of its original meanings of absolute, God, and so on, just by returning it to those meanings when they had their brilliance and their sort of lifetime. As now it sounds like a Vedic hymn. It even smacks of ancient Oriental mythology. I cannot say that I've restored this myth in full accordance with the strict laws that govern all language, but no matter for that. Enough if we have found that symbols in a myth in a sentence that was always essentially mythical and symbolic inasmuch as it was metaphysical. I think I've tried to make you realize one thing, Anatole France says, that any expression of an abstract idea can only be by analogy or metaphor. Can only be by analogy or metaphor. By an odd fate, the very metaphysicians who think to escape the world of appearance are constrained to it perpetually by allegory, metaphor, and analogy. They are a sorry lot of poets. A sorry lot of poets. They dim the colors of their ancient fables. And they are themselves but the gatherers of fables. They produce white mythology. Now Derrida comments, a formula, brief, condensed, economical, and mute, has been deployed in an interminably explicative discourse. The derisive effect which is always produced by the translation of anything Occidental into the Oriental ideogram. Anyway, that's supposed to be funny to really, like funny types of people, academics mainly, but they didn't find it amusing because in the history of philosophy, it's a hard it is the beginning of an argument that many of these words are words, I said being, if we went back, would be God. If we took that word back far enough, it would be the breath of the great beast of the East. Took that back, it would probably be the tree that stands the tallest, and so on. Once we've translated all that out, we do have kind of a Vedic hymn. And philosophy, according to Derrida, is doomed, as it were. If you want doomed to be the word, I think it actually can be playful. And Derrida is witty about it. It's not sad to him that philosophy cannot become finally a great science or anything. They are doomed to be a more or less sorry lot of poets. I mean, the better the poet, the better the wit, the better the philosophy in some cases for Derrida. He clearly likes a good joke. And part of the last argument that it's not an argument, it is an economical statement, mute, and so on, is supposed to be a joke too. But then the political intent is clear underneath it. If philosophy is white mythology, what's to keep us from teaching other mythologies at the university? Like women's mythologies, and black mythologies, and Hispanic mythologies, and Oriental mythologies. I hope you're beginning to see why Derrida began to upset people. If this was true, it wouldn't mean that white mythologies had lost their interest or that they weren't profound and worthy of study, but it would mean they were no more so than black mythology, Hispanic mythology, women's mythology. If I were to look for examples of Derrida's marginality of the spoken or the written word, the trace, the gramy, the many, and I've left out many sophistications here. Who cares? I'm not French. I don't eat soufflés. Forget it. I'm trying to get this across in the spirit of that Chicago Tribune article. This is the disturbing part to academics, is it opens up this road within which many other mythologies, if you will, can be spoken with equal right, as the dominant ones have been in the past. And I think that is not at all a bad effect that Derrida's had. The fact that he has a sense of humor, I don't hold against him. I wish more academics did. I think it's pedagogically useful not to be a damn bore all the time and just, put people to sleep is pedagogically useful. After all, professors and lecturers have to compete with MTV, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Jurassic Park, so I hardly think it's in our interest to be boring. And that's one thing Derrida certainly is not. And it's nice to encounter in the dark days that lay ahead as I trudge through and what a self can be, it's nice to encounter a playful spirit. Derrida is very troubled about what the self might even be. But he is troubled in the playful way that Nietzsche is troubled when he's at his best. And so I hope that I could at least interest you in looking at something of Derrida's. In fact, I'll leave you with one last little joke of Derrida's. So much work has been spent, and so much time has been spent interpreting Nietzsche, and now, of course, paradoxically, Derrida, because these things go on and on, that he wrote a little book called Spurs, Nietzsche's Style. And in it, he makes, he imagines that Nietzsche left behind among his many papers a little scrap of paper that says, "I forgot my umbrella." Then Derrida goes through a long, complex way that an academic interpreter would try to fit this brilliant aphorism of Nietzsche's into the body of his work. I mean, after all, it might just mean I forgot my umbrella, but on the other hand. And, of course, by the time, and this is a short little book that I think you could enjoy, by the time that Derrida is finished, I think that one has at least learned to be an interpreter with more grace and with a little bit more poetry, and perhaps it would free us for richer, more multicultural, more diverse, and more humane interpretations if we could free ourselves from the myth, the invidious myth, that there is a right way to read a book, one. A right civilization to belong to as though we chose it. A right gender to be as though we could pick it. A right class to belong to as though we chose those things. A right race to be. A certain mythology preferable to others, as in white, which according to some African American scholars today, insofar as it's Greek, was stolen from the Africans in the first place. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's certainly an interesting conjecture, and it's one in which the readings and the battles of interpretation, as Derrida points out, will not stop. There won't be a last book, and I'm afraid that also warns you that in this class, as in many others, there won't be a last word. Thank you very much. In the final lecture on the self under siege, we will discuss the work of Jean Baudrillard, a French social theorist. Actually, that now is a misnomer, since one of Baudrillard's theses is the disappearance of the social. Baudrillard is perhaps the most important theorist that can be characterized as postmodern. And I have spent a lot of time, in fact, in a previous lecture series discussing the postmodern. I'm going to give a very brief characterization of it and then discuss Baudrillard's relationship to it. The self under siege in modernity has always presumed that there was a self to be under siege. But in the view of Baudrillard, society has reached a point at which it has literally been overcome by its technology, and the new and important issues aren't about things like the non-believer or the non-offender, but about the non-person. In the world of Baudrillard, social relations have disappeared between humans because humans have begun to disappear. In fact, Baudrillard thinks that reality itself is in the process of disappearing, the real, what has been learned and understood under the name of the real. All these outrageous things I've just said are worked out in a brilliant series of books which draw a lot of their power from many of the phenomena we see around us. So one way to discuss Baudrillard is to run through some of these phenomena. What Baudrillard is doing is basically to trace the symptoms and tendencies of the trajectory of the postmodern. If we were really in a postmodern society, we wouldn't still be discussing things like the self under siege or the real. They would simply have disappeared. There we would be, in a way, transparently communicating one with another, as in an earlier example when I talked about the stock market crashing due to the computer rationality. Well, if we had really reached the postmodern in its fullest sense, the way Baudrillard uses it, it would be the computers unplugging us and not the reverse. The postmodern is a blurring of the lines between human beings and machines, a blurring of the line between reality and image. It is a society, or I can't even really use that word anymore. It is a world, if you will, a grouping of the world in which reality is simply that which can be simulated, Xeroxed, copied. That is one of his first theses. It's a book called Simulations. It's a very interesting thesis. Baudrillard argues that this process is that one of the central things is the way in which that's changed us fundamentally and has helped to bring our relations as humans to a close. I mean, in a way, Baudrillard sees himself as a post-apocalyptic writer. For Baudrillard, the apocalypse has already occurred. It wasn't religious or anything. It was not atomic bombs. At some point in the development of technology, human beings ceased to be the reason of things, and things took on their own reasons, technological things. Let me describe this concept of simulation just a little bit, though. Baudrillard's definition of the real itself is that which can be simulated, Xeroxed, and copied. So whether you're talking about a human body where you can make a holograph of it, or you're talking about the Bible, which you can Xerox, or whether you're talking about the sexual act, which can be simulated either through, repetitive pornographic films, or in a very near future, it will be able to be simulated with virtual reality, where you'll wear a full body suit and make love to your ego ideal, thus making it pointless to search out all the Freudian implications. You can just pick your ego ideal, punch it into the laser beam program, slip into the virtual reality suit, thus rendering that relation, even that intimate relation, sexual relation, technological, simulatable, reproducible to infinity. Now, all this sounds wild, crazy, and I don't want it to sound wild and crazy. I want it to sound the way that I think that it really should sound. And that's as though we could place ourselves, and I've used this analogy before, but I will again, as though we could place ourselves in that era right before the atomic energy and television, before we knew all the myriad changes that they would make in the way that we were and the way we interact and so on. Well, we're in a period now where I've already mentioned, and these are the phenomena that Baudrillard examines with the most care. Incredible information overloads, with information moving at incredible speed, and even to the youngest children. I talked about how children used to learn morality from their parents, and now I think that Super Mario Brothers, they spend much more time with Super Mario Brothers and are much more emotionally involved with Nintendo than they are with their aunts, their uncles, their mothers, and their fathers. I asked one of my children, "Why are you yelling at a machine?" when he began to bang his Nintendo. And he looked at me as though I were a being from another world. And because of that, there is a postmodern trajectory. I am from another world. I'm still, as it were, caught in the modern. He's not. Why not be emotional with a machine? His peers are machine-like. We've already discussed that. I mean, in fact, what he sees on the Nintendo screen is his thrill of the day. That's the most active he's seen any simulated image that day. Now, simulation, this society didn't just come from nowhere, the society of simulations and of spectacles. Baudrillard actually builds his work on a foundation, again, that comes out of the Marxist tradition. Guy Debord wrote a book in the 60s called The Society of the Spectacle. And what it was about how when capitalism reached a certain level of accumulation, commodities began to detach themselves and become images. And citizens who formerly had played roles as political actors began to detach themselves from their own lives and become spectators. So, for example, you could say, well, instead of like going to a family reunion now, we'll just rent, you know, a Steve Martin Father of the Bride movie. It's just as good, and so on, and you meet the same kooky characters that you actually know. Their behavior is all simulatable. Another similar, and this is going to sound cynical, but I don't want it to. I mean, Baudrillard has visited our country, and when he went to Disneyland and Epcot Center and these various parks, he said, well, this is much better than Europe. The food's better than Europe. It's a short walk between France and Germany land. You know, you don't have to go through deal with all those nasty waiters. Everyone's so polite. The simulation has outrun the so-called reality. That concept in Baudrillard he calls the hyper-real. Hyper-reality is more real than real. This is it actually sounds, if some of this sounds like advertising slogans, good, because in Baudrillard, the heritage of philosophy and social theory has passed over into advertising and television. So if it sounds superficial, good, because the theory, the world that he looks at has become superficial and banal. If it sounds hokey, like a salesman's pitch, good. The world he describes is the world of Jurassic Park, not of Dante. So that is all evidence on the side of Baudrillard if you follow the argument deep enough and with enough clarity. Okay, let me explain the hyperreality. This is an important concept in Baudrillard. In Baudrillard, we've already said reality is simply that which can be simulated. Can't be simulated, not real. But more real than real is a reality, and I guess I could give you, again, I hate to use these movie examples if you haven't seen the movies, but in A Clockwork Orange, there's a great line that anticipates the postmodern when the character played by Malcolm McDowell says, it's funny how blood isn't really blood until you video it on the screen, until you see it on the movie screen. In real life, it looks kind of brown and mucky. On the screen, it looks, you know, like more real than real blood. And this sense of the sort of hyper-reality we get with cinema, we get with television and so on, is another phenomenon Baudrillard wants to examine. And I think that here we get, and I mean, I guess my politics are showing again, but here we get the phenomenon of Reagan, the hyper-real president, more real than real. I mean, he's better at being Harry Truman than Harry Truman. I mean, the distinction about what he is lost in the hyper-reality of his smile, which, like the Cheshire Cat's, you know, just gleams across his face. And we get for the first time a phenomenon never known in polling, which is the phenomenon of not liking a person, but of liking a person. This is a sign you're dealing with the hyper-real. Let me go over that again. Reagan's popularity was popular. When you went through the various traits of Reagan and what Reagan stood for and his policies and so on, vast numbers of people disliked nearly all of them. What was popular was his popularity. So, and I don't think that Reagan's alone in this. Show business figures have this same thing go on for years. I can't remember the last Michael Jackson song that I even listened to. Or my kids, who also don't like Michael Jackson. But he's popular, but not in the old sense. It is a hyper-popularity, if you follow me. His it is popular that he's popular. Madonna has learned to live and create herself on the curve of the postmodern by making it her goal to be more popular than popular, by having her popularity the topic of popularity. I mean, we've found out that she can't particularly act or sing. She is not built well enough to be a true cybernetic sex symbol for this period, and yet she manages, because of her understanding of this situation that Baudrillard calls the hyperreal, to stay on this curve of popularity. Hyperreality, of course, affects us across many different spectrums, and it's built on the real. It is not as though the hyperreal could get by without injections of reality in it. It requires, and this is not a principle from Baudrillard, but one that I have realized from watching a lot of television, you have to have injections of reality in order to keep the images afloat occasionally. In fact, one of the new strategies adopted by television, and it serves two functions. One is a cost function, are these reality shows. They've realized that we've become, as it were, too intoxicated with hyper-reality, with, Kojak and Super Cops and so on. So now we just have shows like Cops, where you just go to Fort Worth and film a bunch of cops being cops. That serves a good, intelligent economic interest, because you don't pay cops much just for being cops. It's not that lucrative. And it injects, well, is it reality? Well, it is compared only to this scale of hyperreality and only under the sign of being whatever can be simulated. We have just had our first simulated trial. Not our first, but the first televised one that caused a riot. Rodney King, where the events are videotaped, the trial is shown on television, the effects are all televised, and how anyone can find themselves around in these new phenomena and pretend that nothing new has happened, that frustrates both Baudrillard and myself. I mean, he's not right about everything, but clearly something's different when we're in a world like that one, like this one. Clearly something significant has changed. And it has affected the very nature of what selves are, what humans are, what subjects are. When I talked about how my students had no dreams, I mean, what is there left to dream? When I was a kid, I dreamed about dinosaurs. I had a little Walt Disney dinosaur book. Why would I need to dream about dinosaurs now? Steven Spielberg has made them. He's filmed them. They're more real than real dinosaurs. They're hyper-real. You would be disappointed if you saw a real Tyrannosaurus Rex after the movie. You would be disappointed. It wouldn't be as noisy, as scary, or as frightening. Same is true of Jaws. I've actually caught some rather large sharks. I mean, I like to fish, pier fish. So I've caught a few sharks, some fairly good size. But those real experiences are so boring compared to Jaws. I mean, Jaws is a hyper-real experience. Now, the only way, there's no systematic way to discuss Baudrillard because these things are not systematic. These are the shifting, contingent ways in which cultures change and the people who draw their meanings from them change as the cultures change. So all we can do here is point to certain exemplary phenomena. So let me pick out some more. We've discussed hyperreality and simulations. Let me move on. Why? Because the little individual actors sink into insignificance compared to the damn spectacle of the thing. The spectacle of it. I mean, when humans were less important than God, we could understand because he built everything. When we're less important than a Nintendo, we get confused. That's when we start thinking we're under siege. It's when Billy says, oh yes, you can kill Mom and Dad, but leave the Nintendo. Then we're rightfully upset. The postmodern trajectory leaves us in a situation where drawing the line between the real and the unreal is no longer merely philosophical, but a practical day-to-day issue. See, this is what I want to drive home. We're not off in some fairyland. This is a practical, day-to-day issue of figuring out what's a simulation and what's not. Is this guy really an insurance salesman, or is he here to rob me? You know, I mean, this is no longer Cartesian doubt that one has to conjure up in a meditation. This is a wide, radical doubt about the very ground beneath our feet, the nature of whether it's real or not. Baudrillard says it's best at this point to simply face it that what we are witnessing is the end of the world, the end of human beings, and he thinks that there's no reason to be sad or upset or cynical about it. In fact, Baudrillard calls it the ecstasy of communication. I'm trying to do this in a kind of ironic way. I don't know how one presents this kind of material. I suggest you read books by this person. I brought one called Fatal Strategies, about things one might do under such conditions. Anyway, no, he thinks that just that rather than this being occasion for some deep gloom, the ecstasy of communication means that we should go ahead and realize that America has won the Cold War. America is utopia realized. This is the country everyone dreamed of. It is, of course, with all that we know that goes along with it now, it turns out to be, like all utopias, sadly disappointing. But weren't they always? Weren't they always? Every utopia, in some sense, boring and sadly disappointing? Well, Baudrillard says no, we have to, in spite of this, we have to look upon the end of man, the world, and so on as an opportunity. Because what were these concepts anyway? Like man and world, except concepts by which the world was regulated, policed, mapped, and controlled. All four of which are becoming more and more difficult to do under this situation of rapidly increasing complexity, which I've mentioned many times, and I mean system complexity at every level. Rapid increase in information technologies and invasions directly into the human body that interface it with machines. That goes all the way from plastic surgery to artificial hearts and implants to virtual reality, where we'll be able to make a person who can't walk feel as though he can walk or she can walk. And I mean, this is not a technology I dreamed up. They're trying now to develop cheap, marketable versions of this, as I speak here right now. So Baudrillard doesn't want us to go, oh, it's the end of the world, it's the apocalypse. No, it's too late for that. It's already happened. If you wanted to moan, it was sort of like the moaning curve is past now, and it's time to try to sort of readjust to the flows in some way. And Baudrillard suggests a whole series of what he calls fatal strategies by which we might be able to protect what he calls our fractal selves. If you know what fractals look like in geometry, little reproduced pictures out like this is one way to think of it. Our fractal selves, split, reproducible. We have life changes now, and they've become not changes in our life. For example, to show you the distance that we've traveled, not like Augustine's conversion to Christianity, when he hears, or thinks he hears the voice of God saying, tole, lege, take, read, and he reads the scripture and becomes a Christian, and then he's a new man. He's born again. No, that's over now. Now we change, all right. We change rapidly. We change, as I said, professions 6 or 7 or 8 times, and we change who and what we are the way we used to change our clothes and our fashion. I mean, there are kids now who get through college and they're 6 different people before their junior year. 2 months as a bohemian, 2 months as a pre-med student, 2 months as a preppy, 2 months as a poet, a month and a half as a journalist, a month and a half as an ecologist, a month, and all the requisite uniforms for it. None of it felt None of it part of affect. A fad, a personality formed as a fad, as a fashion, as an ornament. I mean, this really doesn't overstate the case for me. Well, one of the sensations this produces is not the sensations of existentialism like dread, despair, and those, but it produces new sensations. Ecstasy is one of them. I mean, you go to see Jurassic Park or an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie for the ecstasy of communication. By that I mean for the pure neural thrill. Wow, a T-Rex, oh, a raptor, and it just runs through you, raptors, T-Rexes, or Arnold just beats up people that, you know, you view as bad or coded as bad by the society, and there's this visceral, ecstatic feel, like when you get your first facts. I mean, this is, in the old days, your first facts, if you will permit me a slight vulgarity, was when you lost your virginity. Now, it still is, except now we mean faxing, you know, coming out like this, and it's, people tell little secret stories about it. When did you first fax? That's a different world. You know? If you're a fax virgin, you won't understand it. You haven't lived. Yeah, that's the common story. Faxing has replaced a lot of things. Just fax it to me. No, anyway, so ecstasy is one emotion that's produced by it. But don't think that it's the ecstasy of the sublime that Schiller talked about when one sees either a beautiful landscape or of the other feeling of the sublime that one might associate with standing before the Pietà or the David or something like that. It's not that kind of ecstasy. It's more visceral. It's more direct. It's more like the ecstasy that your children feel when they beat, you know, the worst monster at the highest level of the Link 2, you know, one of those new video games. And they beat the big monster, and there's just a visceral, neural thrill of ecstasy. What this may cause in some of the older generation like myself, I've already admitted that I'm still modern. I'm just trying to trace out the postmodern trajectory and look at it. I mean, my kids will have to live in more of it than I will ever see, so I'm trying to understand it and think about it as much as I can. And a sense you get is one that resembles Vertigo. How many of you have seen Vertigo, the great Alfred Hitchcock movie? You know, that sort of sickly sense that you're twisting above sort of abysmally too much of something. This seems to me a fine sort of mood characterization for the postmodern trajectory. A sense of vertigo before all this information. Well, if theses like the ones that I have just described that Baudrillard holds are true, but of course the word true will no longer apply, because we'll be in a setting in which you won't want the true, you'll want the truer than true. You won't even, the false won't even be a good enough lie for you. You'll want the lie better than a lie. I mean, the truer than true explanation. You won't just want Oliver Stone's film about JFK. You'll want the film about how Oliver Stone himself participated in the plot to cover up the real assassins by making the film JFK. So you want the truth about the truth about the truth and all the way down, interminably. Vertigo, that's the sense you get looking down that chain of bizarre stories. And I think that the way people deal with this is interesting. They deal with it as a form of complexity, a word I've used probably too many times. It makes them people caught in this cusp between an old world and an old paradigm that is dying and a new one that it cannot really yet be born. And we find ourselves in that space. And it draws us to people like Ross Perot who say, it's just that simple. It's just that simple. It's just that simple. That's the most powerful political rhetoric in a world with a postmodern trajectory. God, how we would love it if someone could tell us anything was just that simple. And then, of course, when you see a pie chart, you know, oh, a pie chart. I mean, it has more religious meaning now than a crucifix to see a pie chart. I mean, Because why is that so popular? Because it reduces complexity. The complexity is very real, but his little sound bites, his little conversations with Larry King help to reduce that complexity, and they put another message in there. Now, I know it's real complicated, but we can fix it. Americans have always fixed it, and we can fix it. Well, if Baudrillard's right, we fixed it all right. We fixed it all the way up and down. And I mean, you know, we see other people engaging in this same sort of attempting to reduce complexity. I mean, the political parties, to the extent that they exist at all anymore, as anything other than fundraising devices, which I don't know. I don't think they have any ideologies, because in a postmodern situation, who would have an ideology except just as a momentary thing? Like Your Week as a Communist by Susie St. Pierre at Duke. My Week is a Trotskyist. My Week is a Buddhist. My 2 weeks as a follower of the cult of Elvis. I mean, these are papers that you could legitimately expect people to write if they still read or wrote. Not many people still do either read or write much. Reduction of complexity. Let's look at the political parties for a moment. The Republicans, with their great traditions, have come up with the slogan of incredible sophistication. No more tax and spend. Now, any of you who can quack that one out could be a Republican. And I'm using that in the Orwellian sense of quack. You don't need to engage higher brain functions. All you have to do is say, don't take my money, and don't spend it. Well, except on me and my friends. But don't tax and spend. Now, it's not the Democrats are doing any better. I don't guess that's news. I mean, Clinton is now less popular than Castro. If Castro ran against Clinton, Clinton would lose by a few points. I mean, he wouldn't lose big, but he'd lose, you know, by a few points. I mean, especially in a three-person race with Clinton, Castro, Perot, and Gaddafi. I mean, I don't know who would win. In fact, given this postmodern world, any one of the four could emerge with the biggest 1/4, depending on how they ran the campaign. Probably it would depend on who could hire David Gergen. You know, I mean, if Fidel got to Gergen first, he might win the damn thing. We don't know. But the Democrats' response to this tax and spend is, no, we don't. Nah, 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 nah. Invest. This is political debate in a democracy. No, it's not. It's the simulation of politics. Ross Perot is not leading a movement. It is a simulation of a movement. You follow me? This is not a populist revolt. Ross Perot is not Teddy Roosevelt. This is a simulation. Now, am I putting it down? No. In some ways, Ross Perot is paradigmatically more real than real. He is hyper-real. I mean, as opposed to Reagan, he really was a businessman that made millions. You know, I mean, a whole bunch of billions, I think, is fair in Ross's case. And so on. I mean, so in a way, there is more reality to it. In any case, the current political structures are way behind this curve. They don't understand it well at all, in spite of all the talk about the selling of the president. That's very old-fashioned. We all have lived with advertising for years. What we haven't lived with are ads that have more narrative structure and meaning than the programs. And I'll mention a few of those because I think they're interesting. The current McDonald's ads that kind of tell a part of your life story in like a 2.5-minute ad. It's like from when you get married till you have your grandkids till you die, and you get that 2.5 minutes. And then there's a McDonald's thing like, good, I was born, I had kids, I died, in the meantime I got a Big Mac. I mean, this is sort of Gone with the Wind condensed into a short version. It's fast, it's hyper-real, and in the meantime you at least got a Big Mac. And you never will have to be hungry again, you know. Reproduced to infinity over and over on videotape, changed to Laserdisc. You can watch Scarlett O'Hara, say that 1,000,000 times. If we had the technology right now to do it, we could just have Scarlett back there screaming about Tara while I'm doing this. In any case, if Baudrillard is even onto something, what the postmodern trajectory means is that the self is not under siege, it's lost. It's just lost. And if that's true, then all of the strategies by which ordinary people tried to live decent, good lives are lost along with it. I'm not necessarily going to buy that right away. I'm really not. I do think that the new technologies are going to call forth. I mean, this is why the title of this course has been The Self Under Siege. If I didn't think it was a real, virulent, technological siege and just some thought-up philosopher's dream, this would not have interested me. I mean, I have no interest in that. I mean, what I am interested in is what it's changing the lives of my children and your children and so on. What will shape culture, society, and what we used to call society, culture and history. That's what I am interested in. If it is the end of the world, I want to know, so my kids and I can enjoy the apocalypse together. If America is utopia realized, then maybe I'll just settle back and go to Epcot Center and forget Switzerland. Just go on the Swiss ride. This may be what I'll do. I doubt it. I don't like it. The war zone, in other words, may not be, in defending the self, may not be any one of the classical ones, like the working class versus the ruling class, the slaves against the masters, oppressed women against a patriarchal society, blacks against whites. No, the struggle in the future may be to maintain the real against the unreal or the hyper-real or the irreal. The desire for experience, and this is, I'm trying to kind of be upbeat about the situation I think we're in. The desire for experience is also the experience for, is also a desire for a kind of experience. What I mean by that is this, that even in these rather, the rather hopeless picture I painted of the young, there remains something like a curiosity about what experience would be like if I could have one. And there is an absolute extremism everywhere about how far people will go to try to have a genuine experience. If I can still use the word genuine, you see, because again, the language has been polluted by this very movement that I've been describing. If say genuine, you'll think about a genuine beer, or genuine boots, or a genuine, cowboy hat or whatever. No, a genuine experience, an authentic experience, a real experience. The battle lines may be between anonymous forces that have been unleashed by a technology that grew out of capital, that will be controlled in the hands of not many people, perhaps not, we don't know, and people who still would like to have some experience. This wouldn't make them archaic old fuddy-duddies if they said, hey, look, honey, why not tonight? Why don't we really make love, the two of us, instead of getting in our virtual reality sex machines? That may become a revolutionary move in the near future. It may be. It may become interesting if a candidate runs for an office and actually believes one thing. Well, that'd be an incredible new politics. Everybody in America wants a new politics. Well, go out and find somebody that believes one damn thing and run him for something. You'll have a new politics. That's the deficit of experience that hasn't been sucked into this system of images and so on. Now, this sounds extreme, but think of how we're socialized, all of us. Continually bombarded with images from magazines, TVs, newspapers, videotapes. I'm not unaware of where I am. I'm in the circuit too now. Well, this calls for fatal strategies, according to Baudrillard. We have to adopt fatal strategies here. Fatal strategies. Extremes. We have to learn to live with complexity, uncertainty, and a certain amount of vertigo. We just have to do that. We don't have any choice. We only have the dinosaur choice. That's when you kind of wander off into the ice caps and sort of fall away. And I also think that we have to be wary of the overquick reduction of complexity. If some of this lecture has seemed a little weird or to go a little too far, it's because I don't want to reduce quite all of this to slogans. On the other hand, I don't want it to not be funny, because part of the postmodern trajectory itself is a rather humorous joke on the human race, which labored for millennia to reduce working hours in order to produce leisure, so we could enjoy this very leisure that then turns in a kind of vengeful act against us, absorbing our leisure time, which was to be our living time, into time now spent in the service of what can only be called this inhuman spectacle. I mean, it's a very bizarre and twisted fate to which postmodernity has led us. So I would be wary of simple answers to this. One way to follow it to follow some of these developments without reading Baudrillard is to follow cyberpunk artifacts, movies like Blade Runner, and also places which you're likely to show up in anyway. Look at the latest malls and how the tracks are designed in them. You know, the little paths. I mean, you can't walk just anywhere in a mall now, can you? No, I mean, they're little pathways, tracks. Go to Atlanta and see a hotel that gleams like a glistening palace and all this. Well, before I get too carried away with all these phenomena, which you can see around you every day, you've got to remember that even in that hotel in Atlanta, in the winter, the poor still crawl in the postmodern cracks and sleep at night. So, I mean, it is not as though that turning the world, as it were, hyper-real has somehow done anything other than make our situation more extreme vis-a-vis those people who have fallen, as it were, out of the loop altogether. There is in this country now the most alarming lack of sympathy for those people who've fallen off the boat, if you know what I mean. People who've somehow slipped off the track. I mean, I'm not sure they want a lot of sympathy, but if they did, there'd be an alarming short supply of it. And I think part of that is because they add still further to the complexity. When I've talked about the postmodern in the way Baudrillard does as a trajectory, I see it as an emergent aspect of our culture. Our culture is still dominantly modernist, rationalized, capitalist, and so on. And to even make things more complex, thirdly, there are residual elements in our culture left over from earlier periods. For example, patriarchy, left over from a past as ancient, perhaps, as the species. Well, I don't know how much further we can go down this road, but in any case, the road, according to Baudrillard, is an endless set of what will it be fatal strategies, to use his new title. And all we can do is wait and see what will happen. If nothing does, in the sense of the real, Baudrillard will have a kind of confirmation. It's my hope that he will be disconfirmed on the simple grounds that wherever we find power, even the power of the hyper-real, we find counterpower. And where we see an image that reproduces us as inhuman, occasionally we see an image that somehow has the bizarre transcendent power to make us slightly more human again. But it's along that terrain, I think, that the battles and the struggles the self will fight with itself will be fought in the future. A brief recap of the whole journey we've taken here. We tried to, as it were, retrace sort of the history of the accounts of human values given in the Western philosophical tradition. That account seemed to dead end with some rather ordinary philosophical problems. In other words, we found out that most of our accounts wouldn't work too well until we got to Hegel's account, which reminded us that human values and moral and ethical problems come up in historical circumstances, which then forced us to investigate society and history, which opened up immense topics that we've only been able to say suggestive things about. Those topics we've addressed through these second set of lectures today. We've tried to address a few of them. Topics relating to the economy, we've tried to I tried to distill some of what I consider Marx, the important insights Marx has into the economy, and others. In terms of the state, I didn't assign any readings by Max Weber, but I did suggest you look at some Kafka on the state. And then I ended up with culture in the last lecture. And when I got around to culture today, you may have noticed that my remarks became less systematic. Now, I've got to explain why. And that's that a culture based on spectacle and images has a peculiar non-systematic character. It's like the fall TV schedule. All you really know about it, right, is that it's going to appear on a kind of grid. But culture in general, we're not even sure about the grid, let alone, you know, which dumb new sitcom goes in it, but we're not sure about the grid. So when you discuss cultural phenomena today, you almost have to go phenomena by phenomena to see how they fit. But it becomes crucially important for the kind of account I've been trying to give, that if the project is what I said it was in the sets of lectures before, trying to create a human life that's free and so on, it becomes crucially important if the culture itself is beginning to, as it were, destroy, deconstruct, or disrupt the very conditions for being human at all. Because it becomes pointless to talk about free humans in the absence of humans. So the problem of freedom was bad enough, right? Everybody went, I don't think that can ever be done. But by who, now is the question, which is even worse. So that's been the trail that we've followed. Now, the reason that I'm mentioning Freud at all in these last lectures is to remind us and take us back for a moment to Kierkegaard and deepen that analysis, where I did mention despair and used a kind of existential motif to turn it into a social one. Despair not as sort of an existential thing like a Bergman movie, The Seventh Seal or something, but as a social malady that is not merely psychological. Many of you have had the experience, I'm sure, of going to a therapist and hearing him describe the problems you have with your husband and how you should adjust, and you go, geez, I don't think it's that. I think it's really the whole situation, you know, the fact that he has all the money and that my life is shit, and I think that's the problem. Oh, we'll cut that. Anyway, my life is a mess, and that's the problem. Well, those objective problems were what I was trying to show despair to be, and not ones that could be fixed, as it were, by simply, you know, having someone say, adjust. Well, this last part, where I'm going to talk about Freud, is similarly not therapeutic, because that's not the interesting part of Freud to me. The book I've suggested is Civilization and Its Discontents, which has nothing to do, doesn't discuss at all, Freud's Oedipal drama, so there'll be no talk of penis envy, which is, I mean, whatever Freud may have thought about that or why, I don't care. This has to do with the processes that are, as it were, to follow a parallel kind of argument with Marx's. Much of human civilization has been built by economic motivations of which people were culturally unaware. In other words, they've been motivated economically, but cultural meaning made them unaware of it. That's a simple way to put one of Marx's sort of skeptical arguments. A way to look at Nietzsche's arguments could be to frame them in terms of the state, if you want to talk about power. Been motivated by principles of power, but ones of which we're unaware, sort of where they're rooted. To move to Freud, we will talk again about how our lives are motivated in ways of which we may be unaware. And in Freud, of course, the great discovery is the discovery of the unconscious. In a way, Freud's work hinges on an insight that makes all of philosophy problematic. Freud was that thinker who reminded us that the conscious mind, which was the topic of philosophy, both in terms of cognitive things and values, is a very small part of our psychic life. Freud compares the conscious mind in the book I'm talking about now. He compares the conscious mind to a garrison, a captured tiny garrison in an immense city, the city of Rome, with all its layers of history, all its archaic barbarisms, all its hidden avenues covered over by civilization after civilization, and The conscious, that's our mind, that whole thing. But the conscious part of it is that one garrison that's clear, that sort of holds out in this captured city. A magnificent metaphor for all of the surrounding motives, motivations, motifs, desires that drive us, that are not philosophical, that cannot, even if we talk to our therapist a long time, all be brought up at once. Now, it is true that Freud's goal was that the it, the unconscious, the id, translated by Americans as the id, in German, the it, kind of a more normal word. The id, was to become conscious. Ego, the English word again being less spectacular, I, the I. I don't know why translators do that. It's to make the person sound like they're a scientist. You know? Freud says id and I, and we go id and ego, and it's all of a sudden it sounds like science. It's not. It's just it's a myth, but a very interesting, fascinating one. So the goal of analytic treatment would be for those unreflected, massive areas, again, to go back to that metaphor of the city, to become part of the garrison as it spreads out, things that we're clear about. In other words, it's not a bad metaphor saying we shouldn't be clear about who we are and have an I or a self or a subject. Now, why am I bringing this up now? Well, to contrast it with my last remarks about culture, if the goal of psychoanalysis is that the unreflected parts of us become reflected, that the it become the I, then the goal of a mass simulational culture, and this is a remark that I'm using from the Frankfurt School, don't worry about it, the goal of a mass telecommunication culture is psychoanalysis in reverse. It's that the little last remaining parts of that garrison become unconscious. It's precisely to reverse that process of enlightenment. Mass culture is enlightenment in reverse gear. Precisely to wipe out that last little garrison of autonomy. It is a constant assault upon it. That was why, in the last time I was out here, I approached it first from this religious angle of Kierkegaard's and characterized the assault as one that caused despair, where despair was not a mood, but a structure that belongs to a captured garrison. Not an accidental feature of a captured garrison, but part of it, a structure of it, fundamental to it. And so now, the reason to use the Freudian text is to remind us that the kind of culture I'm talking about is simply to reverse that process that Freud saw as the goal of talking it out. Well, philosophy has always been a form of therapy in that sense. You all know that from nights when your life has felt like it wasn't working, and you got together with somebody you liked and you got drunk and you talked about what did it all mean, or what does it all mean, and you start talking it out. Well, the goal of that is those unreflected parts are to become reflected. The account I'm giving of this mass telecommunication culture, postmodern culture, is that its goal is the opposite. That the I become it. That the parts that were just yours become general property. So that even if you're an idiosyncratic single woman, like the days and nights of Molly Dodd again, which is a nice thing to be, by the time you've watched a few of those, there's not much of you left that isn't it. You can forget about it. It's been understood. It's now part of the general property of everyone. I gave the example earlier. I'll return to it for the fourth time of the telephone sex. It's just an amazing phenomenon to me. First of all, I can't imagine anyone that bored. But in any case, they're your deepest fantasies, which Freud was going to draw out in an analytic framework. No, that's the way that something that was going to be I, that special thing, no matter how perverse. See, remember, Freud, when something becomes reflected in Freud's picture, you may not know this, but even if it's sick, you're supposed to remember it, and it's supposed to become part of the part of you that you know. So you dig up even really ugly memories so that you can know them and know them about yourself. It may not be pleasant. In fact, it isn't. But then again, that's part of the pleasure principle of mass culture, is it does just the opposite. It takes socially uncomfortable memories and takes them out of that clear garrison and throws them into the wasteland around the city. In the way that elements of the culture of the late 60s broke everyone's heart. Because families were divided, the country was divided. No one knew what kind of culture we should have after that or during that. No one knew who the heroes were, whether it was the boys that were forced to fight, the grunts down there, or Quaker pacifists who froze in jails in this city. No one had the guts to choose or the way to choose. So our culture since then has been not just about the 60s, but other great revolutionary moments, as I'm not afraid to say, is in the process continually of burying and reburying them, making them part of the it, scattered out all around. I can go further back based on my father's memories. Great moments of rebellion like the populist movement around the turn of the century, the Knights of Labor and so on. It's the goal of a mass culture to bury that. It's a goal of mass culture to take that part of a culture where we've begun to reflect and understand and reverse it and make it unconscious. So that's the reason the discourse of Freud is important. It's because the parts of our culture that we understand and can reflect on are just those tiny garrisons. Around it, the mass of the culture, and one can think in our situation of the tons of information, for example. This city probably has, this city we're in, 10 billion tons of paper on which are printed billions and billions and billions of words. Perfectly analogous to Freud's unconscious. No one's going to dig most of them up. Most of them have no meaning to anyone. The goal of mass culture is to make sure that the narratives of our lives fit somewhere in those documents. Just as fallible, malleable, trainable as possible. So during my break of the lecture, I had another movie suggested to me that raises the possibility in another way, and again a way that would have bothered Freud, because for Freud, similar with Proust, I don't know if any of you read long books like Remembrance of Things Past, but to the extent you remember the past, you again expand the room of the eye, the garrison, the little clear part of your head, dig it up from its buried past. So that's the process working in the direction of enlightenment, which it can. It can work in that direction. But my argument has been that it is endangered in ways that we couldn't suspect. The movie I have in mind here is Total Recall. In Total Recall, the character thinks throughout that he's a revolutionary hero, and it all seems to be taking place in the conscious, clear garrison of the mind, the I, the conscious, clear place. As many of you have seen Total Recall know, however, the dream tape that he's on, which gives him real memories and avoids all... By the way, let me say, don't be too cynical about this. In Total Recall, it is true that the people that sold him the vacation are telling the truth about vacations. Vacations are a pain in the behind. They're a lot of trouble, and why not just come back after a few hours with all the right memories, but with no bug bites and, no flat tires, and then go on. So it's a good product. That's the dialectic of the situation. It's also a good product. But after he's fought this great battle, and the whole movie is taken place in this clear spot, right? It looks like an action movie. You notice that the dream vacation he ended up buying was called Blue Sky Over Mars, which is how the movie ends, with these blue skies over Mars. And you realize, well, with memories like that, now he's a revolutionary hero. And it's conscious. See, it looks conscious. So the duplicity that Freud located in consciousness recurs in culture in an even more savage way. Because even in the most private parts of the eye, where we think we're clearest, in principle we can't be sure that they're not already invaded, enculturated, stamped, coded, filed, indexed, Not in a direct, crude way like in Total Recall, because television is already more subtle than that. Again, from my generational perspective, things may look different, but I'll have to use it. You can use yours when you want to. We can talk later. But from my generational perspective, it's been a very bizarre experience to see your earlier life recreated as a kind of drama of a period in which you quasi-recognize yourself, but realize they've invaded everything that meant anything to you and taken it over as a game like Trivial Pursuit. It's like sitting in the nice cafe and hearing a Doors album on Muzak. And some very important part of what made you who you are now has become unreflective to you. You get where you don't even listen. In fact, listening is maybe where I'll want to stop. Since I've talked so much, would like to stop maybe on the topic of listening. I've got a long time to talk about listening. Paradox. But in a culture so overloaded, where we already suspect, if we don't know, that its goal is psychoanalysis in reverse, to make the parts of us that think into ones that don't, that just react, follow, or replicate. One thing that we can do is tune out. So many of us do that in one form or another. We take the culture and simply try to tune out as much of it as we can. But there's a flaw in the strategy. And that's that no culture ever was so pervasive. Even this word may be bothering you. There was a time when culture meant going to the things created by us folks as opposed to nature. Where's nature now? There isn't one. Everything has been enculturated. The most beautiful natural scenes there are the filmed ones that are created through fractal geometry at IBM. And I heard a great remark, and that's that the Swiss cuisine at Busch Gardens is better than the food in Switzerland. And more Swiss. So why bother to go? No reason. The food's better. There's a Swiss person. There's some yodeling. I've been there. The rest of it's just clocks. Well, there's a clock, So this is a culture that, in a way, my critical remarks are beginning to break down. Have you noticed that? Because now it looks as though that we're heading toward a society where you can plug yourself into it and it will meet your needs. You can press in the needs in the machine and it will meet them. Big screen TV, CDs all around, every human need, maybe including the earlier one I discussed, it's radical freedom. I said I wanted to go out on a date with Kathleen Turner. Well, who knows? They'll three-dimensional replicant, punch it in, here she comes. Hello. Since it's replicable image, virtual reality suit, maybe they'll be able to sell me that and every other need for all of you, everyone. But in the matrix of needs in such a possible future system, as if it weren't already kind of like that, within such a possible future system, the only command or need that the machine would not respond to would be the one command that I have a feeling some of us would most want to type into the machine, which is the demand that it destroy itself. You see, that would be my problem with the machine. It would meet all the needs except my need to see it destroyed. It would take every other command well and meet every other need well, but the need to just shut it down. Television is something like that now. It will meet so many psychic needs and fulfill so many compensatory things for you. We all know how it feels after a day of work to turn on our familiar show. I'm not making fun of it. It feels the same for me. Cheers again. I've seen this one. Whew, you're out of it for a while. It just... But the one command you can't order on the television or the show you can't get is the one that blows all the TVs in the world up. It won't do that. The demand even to turn it off is ridiculous. It's a ridiculous thing. And they go, oh, you could just turn it off. Yeah, on pain of falling out of anything that even resembles the resemblance of reality. I didn't say resembles reality, but resembles its resemblance. You know, you don't watch TV for 2 weeks in this country and you walk around going, what happened? Well, you know damn well the same old stuff, but you still feel disconnected. You know, it's been bad here in Georgetown. You don't have cable here. I'm going, no cable? You know, how backward are these people? Do you guys cook, you know, over open fires? I mean, you've got no cable? This close to the White House and no cable? So I had to walk up to a bartender and I said, how's the war going? He goes, still winning. Well, I knew that. I knew it without watching it. A priori, we're going to always be still winning. That's an a priori truth about the war. I can guarantee you. Every day the news will be the same. We're winning. How about that? See, I can predict things based on my theory. We're going to win. See, it's a good prediction. We'll win. Any case, this may sound too cynical. I've tried to well, of course it sounds too cynical, but it's sort of hard to feel bad about that, about ending up in a kind of cynical spot, because the handlers and the various the handlers of the systems of mass culture could not possibly be more cynical than they are, both about public taste, about their own complicity with power. I love to see a news report that says, oh, by the way, we're speaking for the people who run your life. Don't worry about it. This news report is not true. Then we go, oh, good, I'm going to watch the not true news report. So, I mean, don't kill the messenger. You get it? I didn't build that system. I'm just trying to describe it to you. If the description of it sounds cynical, on the other side of it, there is a possible kind of freedom. On the other side of it, I don't know how to describe it or how to even evoke it. But it's clear that where we can make systems of this complexity, cultural systems, economic systems, machines and so on of this complexity, surely we could make a world that could first meet those needs I described that everyone should have, and then perhaps meet needs that people have only dreamed of, like the need for some autonomy and freedom. The need for that little space up there, the I part, to expand a little bit, just a little, with the full knowledge that you're going to still be a fallible, finite human. It's still a reasonable thing to want some parts of your life to be clear and reflected. That's still reasonable to want, even in the face of knowing that the full achievement of that's very unlikely. For Freud, civilization was a drama between two principles, eros and thanatos, or to use Woody Allen's more normal words, love and death. And in this book, this last book I'm discussing, Freud paints a beautiful and quick panorama of civilization as being a struggle between these two, what he calls eternal principles. Well, on the account I've been giving, the mechanisms of one side have clearly gained the upper hand. Just clearly. It's not, on that I really don't think it's that debatable. But one can expect, as Freud admitted, in an hour, in a history, in a time in the history of the world as dark as this one, Freud admitted that it could be expected, perhaps, that the other adversary, eternal eros, might come in and strike a blow for the other side, that the mechanisms of death and forgetfulness, which are very closely aligned, final death and forgetfulness, very close, that it might be expected that eros would make a comeback, possibly. That's not much of a keep hope alive message in a culture like this one, especially as it threatens to become global under conditions where many of the people in other parts of the world that receive our culture will do so with extreme naivete. In Eastern Europe, they'll believe we've got a democracy. They'll love to have a VCR, and with each step forward, they'll become more entrapped in the same totalitarian system that is much more subtle than the crude and simple one that many of them have overthrown. What a joy to overthrow a crude and simple totalitarian system. I mean, all of us enjoyed that, right? Dancing on the wall was fun because that system was so crude and not postmodern enough. It didn't understand that there are walls you can build that cannot be seen between people. Those are harder walls to overthrow. The walls they build between different races and classes and sexes in our society, those walls are much more difficult to overthrow than crude and stupid walls like the Great Wall of China, which doesn't wall anybody out, it just walls you in. But the stupid forms of totalitarianism build these walls in a way that people can storm them. The global system that I'm talking about, not is already here perhaps, but is on its way, perhaps. About the present and future, you can just guess. I mean, that's what scientists do too. Make their best guess. You can just guess, but about this system, the walls will be much harder to storm because they won't be the kind that will be available for storming. It's hard to storm the walls on TV. In fact, you'll already, like in Total Recall, have the feeling you've already stormed them. You've already, the guy in Total Recall, well, he's already won the revolution. It's cool. He did it in 10 minutes sitting in a chair injected with the same emotion. So those kind of walls and that kind of totalitarianism, I suspect many people in the world don't suspect is the dark side of the American dream. I hope that there will be forms of resistance. But the basis of that hope today is slim. I'd be less than honest if I said it was more than slim. I expect, and with Freud, hope that the final word hasn't been said. I don't think that, in a way, it is part of this system that final words are sayable, even in this system. And I will have to say this about it, that it has to re-inject, and I haven't got a good argument for this in the time remaining. It does have to re-inject resistance into it in some form or another. It's important that it at least put up a simulation of opposition. That's why the most powerful anti-war movement America could have now would be for the last few of us that are against the war to disappear completely so that it looks like those polls are 100%. And many of my friends have started throwing off the poll numbers and joining the pro-demonstrators because the worst statement we can make about our democracy is to be unanimously for something which will make itself evident it's no democracy. So the most radical thing, in our culture, struggles will have to become more sophisticated. Instead of fighting Bush, maybe the best way to fight him is to agree with him. Say, hell yes, bomb them all and get right with them. Talk all of your wildest friends into it. Say, yeah, because once 100%, that's saturation. No opposition, Bush will go. What will we do for a TV spot? They'll have to start hiring the CIA to go out and demonstrate. They would. I mean, there's no opposition. That's what we used to say we were a democracy, was the opposition. So there'll be all kinds of new strategies. And I have not yet given up on that last remaining spots of clarity that are around in the world. To quote George Bush, those 1,000 points of light. Well, it might turn out that they might not be what he suspects. I'm just not willing quite yet, and I don't know, I guess your questions will be, why not, to write radical democracy's final obituary. And yet, and this is the point where I have to say, I don't have an argument. It's taken me a long time. I just don't have an argument about why not to write its final obituary. I've seen too much of this especially the last 15 years or so, of Reagan and Bush, not to feel like writing that last obituary for radical democracy, or even for these private moments that I have tried to steal from this text, where we have that clear thought in our own mind and we're sure it's not the unreflected part being produced by our culture. I'm not quite, even under these conditions, ready to write the final obituary. I don't have any argument, but at least I have this much going for me. I mean, now I'm really going to go back to an archaic text called the New Testament. Don't have a good revolutionary argument to hook you with at the end. I mean, in a way, that's why I said preaching. I feel like Paul before the Corinthians, and they're all real cynical, and I can say that I'm pretty cynical, you're pretty cynical. St. Paul was pretty cynical. All the Corinthians are going, this resurrection in the body stuff. Kind of like some of you may go, this radical democracy stuff. What do you mean resurrection in the body, St. Paul? What do you mean freedom, radical democracy, enlightenment? What the hell are you talking about? Well, if you read Corinthians, it's very strange. The people at Corinth are really questioning Paul very tough. You know, resurrection in what body? When I was 16, 15, 14? Where will I be and stuff? Well, please, this is my last reading assignment, and it's a widely known text. It's the Bible. Look at Paul's answer in Corinthians. It's a masterpiece of sophistry, rhetoric, and bitter invective. No arguments, because how could you have an argument for such a utopian thing? You couldn't. But Paul does have one consideration that is very persuasive to the Corinthians, that if this hope goes, everything goes with it. It's a desperate form of argument, but these are desperate times. If the hope goes to reconstruct our lives in that way, everything else will go with it. Everything. And not in that neat, fun way like the apocalypse, where you all get to Rod Serling yourselves out together, and me too, but everything human will go too. So if there's no other reason to hope that things will change, then hope was, after all, only given in the first place for those who were hopeless. Hope was given for the sake of the hopeless, not for people who are comfortable. Philosophy, as I said, doesn't provide comfort to the comfortable. It shouldn't. It doesn't even provide comfort to the afflicted, as you may have found out if you're afflicted. It is, as I've tried to warn you when I started, disconsolate in principle. Hegel says it in a scarier way. He says, dialectics or philosophy does not run from death and devastation, but it tarries with it a while and looks it in the face. So that's all I've tried to do with our culture in this last couple of hours, which may have seemed strange to some of you. You may think, oh, things aren't that bad, because after all, the TVs are still running, the people are for it, and everybody's happy, and I'll go back to my normal life. And unfortunately, giving talks like this is part of my normal life. But don't forget as you watch the TV that the fires of Belsen burn in the TV tubes every night. Don't forget that the structural principles of our society are as barbaric in their structure as they ever were, perhaps more so. Perhaps more so. We have to remember we're talking at a historical moment when most folks want to nuke somebody again. Why not?